Sir, would you like to side the cafe and...
Thank you, but I'm fine here.
She fed a homeless man every morning. Then 12 Marines arrived at her wedding to salute her. When cafe owner Maria Rodriguez started leaving breakfast for the silent homeless veteran outside her shop, she never expected it would change her life. But when 12 Marines in dress blues appeared at her wedding to honor the man she'd fed every morning, the truth about his identity would shock everyone. Every morning at 6:15 a.m., Maria Rodriguez unlocked the doors of Sunrise Cafe in downtown Phoenix, the aroma of fresh coffee and baking pastries following her onto the sidewalk. The small cafe had been her dream for 5 years, a place where construction workers, office employees, and early commuters could start their day with something warm and homemade. But Maria's attention was always drawn to the same spot across the street, a weathered bus bench where an elderly man sat in silence, watching the world wake up around him with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of untold stories. Maria had immigrated from Mexico with her parents when she was 12, and she understood what it meant to feel invisible in a world that often looked past people who were different or struggling. At 28, she had built Sunrise Cafe from nothing, working 18-hour days and pouring every dollar back into the business. Her warm smile and genuine interest in her customers' lives had made the cafe a neighborhood institution, but it was her compassion for those society overlooked that truly defined her character. The homeless man had appeared on the bench about 6 months earlier. He was always clean despite his worn clothes, and he carried himself with a dignity that suggested he hadn't always lived on the streets. His gray hair was neatly trimmed, and his posture remained straight even when he slept sitting up. Most people hurried past without acknowledging his presence, but Maria found herself watching him, wondering about his story and whether he had family somewhere who missed him. She had tried approaching him several times, offering coffee or a pastry, but he would simply nod politely and wave her away. He never spoke, never asked for anything, and never caused any trouble. He was simply there, as much a part of the morning routine as the sunrise itself. On a particularly cold February morning, Maria watched the man shiver on the bench while she prepared the cafe for opening. Something inside her shifted as she saw him pull his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders. She couldn't force him to accept help directly, but there was nothing stopping her from leaving a cup of coffee and a warm breakfast sandwich on the bench beside him. That morning, Maria quietly placed the food next to the man and returned to her cafe without a word. When she looked out an hour later, both the coffee cup and the wrapper were gone, neatly placed in the nearby trash can. What started as a single act of kindness became a daily ritual. Every morning, Maria would prepare an extra breakfast, coffee, a sandwich, and sometimes a pastry, and quietly place it on the bench beside the silent man. She never lingered, never tried to force conversation, and never expected acknowledgement. The food was simply there when he arrived and gone when she checked later. The routine continued for weeks. Maria began to learn the man's preferences through observation. He seemed to enjoy the breakfast burritos more than sandwiches, preferred black coffee to cream and sugar, and always saved half of any pastry for later. These small details made Maria feel connected to him, as if they were having a conversation without words. Her fiancé, David, a high school teacher who often stopped by the cafe before work, noticed Maria's morning ritual. "You know you can't save everyone," he said gently one morning. as he watched her prepare the extra breakfast. "I'm not trying to save anyone," Maria replied. "I'm just making sure one person doesn't start their day hungry." David's expression softened. It was one of the many reasons he loved Maria, her instinctive compassion for others, even when it cost her time and money she could barely spare. Not everyone approved of Maria's daily gesture. Some regular customers complained that feeding the homeless man would attract others, potentially hurting the cafe's reputation. Mrs. Patterson, who owned the flower shop next door, was particularly vocal in her disapproval. "You're encouraging vagrancy," she told Maria during one of their tense conversations. "That man should be in a shelter or getting help, not sitting on our street corner." "He's not hurting anyone," Maria replied calmly, "and everyone deserves to eat." But for every critic, there were supporters. Construction worker Tony Martinez started leaving extra change in the tip jar specifically for the breakfast fund. Teacher Sarah Chin brought her students by the cafe to talk about compassion and community service. Even police officer James Wilson, who patrolled the area, had grown protective of both Maria and the silent man. "That guy's no trouble," Officer Wilson told Mrs. Patterson when she called to complain. "He's cleaner and more respectful than half the people who work downtown. And Maria's doing something good here." The homeless man himself remained an enigma. He never spoke to Maria, but she began to notice small acknowledgments. A slight nod when she approached careful placement of the empty containers, and what might have been the ghost of a smile when she included something special. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday morning in April. Maria arrived to find the homeless man huddled under the bus stop's small shelter, soaked despite his efforts to stay dry. Without thinking, she approached with an umbrella and the day's breakfast. "Sir," she said gently, "would you like to wait inside the cafe until the rain stops? You don't have to buy anything." For the first time in months of daily encounters, the man looked directly at her. His eyes were a striking blue, intelligent and alert, despite the weariness they carried. He studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether her offer was genuine. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice hoarse from disuse, "but I'm fine here." It was the first time Maria had heard him speak, and something in his tone, the careful pronunciation, the underlying authority, suggested education and refinement that didn't match his current circumstances. "The offer stands any time," Maria said, placing the breakfast beside him. "I'm Maria, by the way." The man hesitated, then nodded. "I know. Thank you for everything." As Maria walked back to her cafe, she realized that their silent relationship had just become something more. After their brief conversation in the rain, the dynamic between Maria and the homeless man began to shift subtly. He still didn't come inside the cafe, but he started acknowledging her morning deliveries with a quiet "thank you" and occasional comments about the weather or the neighborhood. Maria learned that his name was Robert, though he didn't offer a last name. She discovered that he was a veteran. He mentioned serving a long time ago when she thanked him for his service on Veterans Day. He was clearly educated, occasionally using words or references that suggested a background very different from his current circumstances. "You don't have to do this every day," Robert told her one morning as she delivered his usual breakfast. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden," Maria replied firmly. "You're part of my morning routine now. Besides, I make extra anyway." It was a small lie, Maria had started budgeting specifically for Robert's meals, sometimes skipping her own lunch to afford the extra food. But seeing him eat something warm and nutritious had become as important to her as opening the cafe itself. As spring turned to summer, Maria and David's wedding plans intensified. They had chosen a small ceremony at a local community center, followed by a reception at the cafe. Maria was excited but stressed about the costs and logistics of hosting their celebration while keeping the business running. Robert had become a quiet witness to the wedding preparations. He listened as Maria talked to vendors on her phone outside the cafe, watched delivery trucks bring flowers and decorations, and observed the growing excitement in the neighborhood about the upcoming celebration. One morning, as Maria delivered his breakfast, Robert surprised her with a question. "When is your wedding?" "Next Saturday," Maria replied. "We're having the reception here at the cafe. Nothing fancy, just family and friends." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "You'll make a beautiful bride. David is a lucky man." Maria was touched by his words. Over the months, Robert had become more than just someone she fed. He had become a friend, a quiet presence who had witnessed her daily struggles and small triumphs. "I wish you could be there," Maria said impulsively. "You've been part of my life here for so long." Robert's expression grew distant. "I don't think that would be appropriate, but thank you." As the wedding approached, Maria noticed changes in Robert's behavior. He seemed more alert, more focused, as if he were making some kind of decision. She also noticed that he had been writing in a small notebook, something she'd never seen him do before. One morning, Maria arrived to find Robert wasn't at his usual spot on the bench. She felt a pang of worry. In all the months she'd been feeding him, he had never missed a morning. She left his breakfast anyway, hoping he would return. Robert appeared the next day, but he looked different somehow. His clothes were cleaner, his hair more neatly trimmed, and he carried himself with a bearing that seemed almost military. When Maria approached with his breakfast, he stood up, something he rarely did. "Maria," he said formally, "I need to tell you something. I haven't been entirely honest about who I am." Maria felt her heart skip. "Robert, you don't owe me any explanations. I've never asked." "I know," he interrupted gently. "That's what made your kindness so pure. You helped me without needing to know my story, but I think it's time you knew." Robert reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn military ID card. "My name is Colonel Robert Hayes, United States Marine Corps, retired." Maria stared at the ID card, trying to process what Robert was telling her. Colonel Hayes, she could barely think of him by his real name, watched her reaction carefully. "I served 30 years in the Marines," he continued. "Commanded troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, received commendations, had a successful career. But when my wife died 3 years ago, I lost myself." He explained how grief and survivor's guilt had consumed him after his wife's death from cancer. He had pushed away family and friends, eventually losing his home and ending up on the streets. The bench across from Maria's cafe had become his refuge, a place where he could watch normal life continue while he tried to figure out how to rejoin it. "I've been living on my military pension," he said. "I have money, Maria. I could afford food and shelter, but I couldn't afford to feel human again. You gave me that." Maria felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because your wedding is in 3 days, and I want to give you a gift." not just me. Some friends of mine want to honor what you've done." Robert smiled for the first time since she'd known him. "I made some phone calls." Maria spent the next 2 days in a state of confusion and emotional turmoil. Learning that Robert was actually a retired Marine colonel changed everything and nothing at the same time. She was happy that he wasn't truly homeless and destitute, but she also felt somehow deceived, even though she understood his reasons for not revealing his identity. "I don't know how to feel about this," she confided to David the night before their wedding. "For months, I thought I was helping someone who had nothing. Now I find out he's been choosing to live on the streets." David, ever the voice of reason, helped her process her emotions. "Does it change what you did? Does it make your kindness less meaningful?" "No," Maria admitted. "But it makes me question whether I was actually helping or just enabling him to avoid dealing with his problems." The revelation had also created practical concerns. Robert had mentioned friends who wanted to honor her, but he'd been vague about the details. Maria was worried that whatever he had planned might overshadow her simple wedding celebration. She had envisioned an intimate gathering of family and friends, not some kind of military ceremony. "What if he's planning something elaborate?" Maria worried. "What if it turns our wedding into something about him instead of about us?" David took her hands. "Maria, you've spent months caring about this man without expecting anything in return. Trust that he cares about you the same way." The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, but Maria woke up with a knot of anxiety in her stomach. She had barely slept, alternating between excitement about marrying David and worry about what Robert might have planned. As she prepared for the ceremony, Maria kept glancing out the window toward the bus bench where Robert usually sat. It was empty, and she hadn't seen him since their conversation 3 days earlier. Part of her wondered if he had disappeared again, unable to face whatever emotions their relationship had stirred up. Her sister Carmen, who was serving as maid of honor, noticed Maria's distraction. "You're supposed to be nervous about getting married, not about some homeless guy," Carmen said, though not unkindly. She had watched Maria's daily ritual with a mixture of admiration and concern. "He's not just some homeless guy," Maria replied, applying her makeup with shaking hands. It's complicated." The wedding ceremony was scheduled for 2 p.m. at St. Anthony's Community Center, with the reception following at the café. Maria had spent weeks decorating both venues, transforming the simple spaces into something magical, with flowers, lights, and personal touches that reflected her and David's journey together. As the time approached, Maria tried to focus on the joy of the day. She was marrying her best friend, surrounded by people who loved them. Whatever Robert had planned, or even if he didn't show up at all, shouldn't overshadow the celebration of her and David's commitment to each other. But as she put on her wedding dress, a simple but elegant gown that had belonged to her grandmother Maria, couldn't shake the feeling that this day was going to be more significant than she had ever imagined. The ceremony proceeded beautifully. Maria and David exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to support each other's dreams and to always find ways to help their community together. Their families and friends filled the small chapel with love and laughter, and for a moment, Maria forgot all about her anxiety over Robert's mysterious plans. As they walked down the aisle as husband and wife, Maria felt pure joy. Whatever happened next, she was married to the man she loved, surrounded by people who cared about them. The reception at the cafe would be the perfect ending to a perfect day. But as they approached the cafe for the reception, Maria saw something that made her stop in her tracks. 12 Marines in dress blue uniforms stood at attention outside her cafe, their white gloves and polished brass gleaming in the afternoon sun. At their head stood Robert, Colonel Hayes, also in dress blues, his chest decorated with ribbons and medals that spoke of a distinguished military career. He looked like a completely different person from the man she had been feeding on the bench, yet his eyes were the same kind, intelligent blue that had watched her with gratitude every morning. "Maria," David whispered, "I think your friend kept his promise." As Maria and David approached the cafe, Colonel Hayes stepped forward and saluted. The 12 Marines behind him followed suit, creating a moment of such unexpected formality and respect that the wedding guests fell silent. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Colonel Hayes said, using Maria's new married name for the first time, "on behalf of the United States Marine Corps and these Marines who have served with honor, we request permission to honor you for your service to a fellow Marine." Maria felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Colonel Hayes, I don't understand. For 6 months, you fed me every morning without asking questions, without expecting anything in return, and without knowing who I was," he continued. "You saw a human being who needed help, and you helped. That kind of compassion is what we fight to protect." One of the younger Marines stepped forward. "Ma'am, Colonel Hayes told us how you took care of him when he was at his lowest point. In the Marines, we don't leave anyone behind. You live that principle every day." The wedding guests, initially confused by the military presence, began to understand what was happening. Maria's daily act of kindness had touched not just one man, but an entire community of Marines who understood the value of taking care of each other. Maria looked at the faces of the Marines standing before her cafe, then at Colonel Hayes, who was no longer the silent, broken man she had known. She realized that her months of feeding him hadn't been about the food at all. They had been about recognition, dignity, and the simple act of seeing someone who felt invisible. "I just gave you breakfast," Maria said, her voice shaking with emotion. "No," Colonel Hayes replied firmly. "You gave me hope. You reminded me that I was still worth caring about when I had forgotten it myself." He gestured to the Marines behind him. "These men have all struggled with coming home from war, with finding their place in civilian life. Your story reminded us that there are still people who understand service, who live it every day in small acts of kindness." Maria felt David's hand squeeze hers, and she realized that this moment was exactly what their marriage was about, supporting each other in making the world a little better. Colonel Hayes reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded American flag. "This flag flew over our base in Afghanistan during my last deployment. I want you to have it not just as thanks for what you did for me, but as recognition of your service to our community." As he presented the flag to Maria, each of the 12 Marines stepped forward to shake her hand and thank her personally. They shared brief stories of their own struggles with civilian life, their battles with PTSD, and how Maria's example had inspired them to look for ways to serve their communities. "Ma'am," said Sergeant Martinez, a young Marine with kind eyes, "Colonel Hayes told us that you never asked him for his story, never made him feel ashamed. That's the kind of respect every veteran deserves." Another Marine Staff Sergeant Johnson added, "You showed him that his life still had value when he couldn't see it himself. That's the greatest gift you can give someone. The wedding guests, initially surprised by the military ceremony, began to understand the significance of what they were witnessing. Mrs. Patterson, the flower shop owner who had criticized Maria's daily routine, approached with tears in her eyes. "Maria, I owe you an apology," she said. "I thought you were just enabling someone, but you were saving someone." Other neighbors and customers began sharing their own observations of Maria's daily ritual. Tony Martinez, the construction worker, revealed that he had been inspired to volunteer at a veterans shelter. Teacher Sarah Chen talked about how she had used Maria's example to teach her students about compassion and community service. "You didn't just help one man," said Officer Wilson, who had been quietly protecting both Maria and Colonel Hayes during their morning encounters. "You showed all of us what it means to truly see people who are struggling." The reception that followed was unlike anything Maria had imagined. The Marines shared stories of their service and their struggles with civilian life. Colonel Hayes spoke about his journey from despair to hope, crediting Maria's daily kindness with saving his life. "I had given up," he told the gathered crowd. "I was just waiting to die. But every morning Maria reminded me that someone cared whether I lived or died. That was enough to keep me going until I could find my way back." As the evening wound down, Colonel Hayes made one final announcement that left everyone speechless. "Maria, you've spent months feeding one veteran. I'd like to help you feed many more." He explained that he had been working with the VA and local veterans organizations to establish a program that would provide meals and support services to homeless and struggling veterans. "I want to fund an expansion of your café, a section dedicated to serving veterans who need a place to belong." The proposal was overwhelming. Maria would be able to hire additional staff, expand her space, and create a formal program to help veterans transition back to civilian life. It would be called the Morning Bench, in honor of where their friendship had begun. "You gave me my life back," Colonel Hayes said. "Let me help you give that gift to others." As Maria and David stood surrounded by Marines, family, friends, and neighbors, she realized that her simple act of daily kindness had grown into something much larger than she had ever imagined. The cafe that had been her dream was about to become a beacon of hope for veterans who needed to know that someone cared about their well-being. "I accept," Maria said, her voice strong despite her tears, "but only if Colonel Hayes agrees to be our first official customer every morning." The crowd erupted in applause as Colonel Hayes saluted one final time. "It would be my honor, Mrs. Rodriguez." As the Marines prepared to leave, they formed an honor guard for the newlyweds, creating an aisle of raised swords for Maria and David to walk through. It was a fairy tale ending that no one could have predicted, born from the simple belief that everyone deserves to be seen, fed, and cared for. Within a month of the wedding, construction began on the expansion of Sunrise Cafe. The new section, the Morning Bench, featured comfortable seating, a quiet atmosphere, and a policy that no veteran would ever be turned away for lack of funds. Colonel Hayes became not just the first customer, but also a volunteer coordinator, helping to connect struggling veterans with resources and support. The story of Maria's wedding and the Marines' tribute spread through social media and local news outlets, inspiring similar programs in other cities. Donations poured in from across the country, allowing Maria to hire additional staff and expand services beyond just meals to include job placement assistance and counseling referrals. The original bus bench where Colonel Hayes had sat was preserved and moved inside the cafe, becoming a symbol of hope and second chances. A small plaque beside it read, "Every person has a story worth knowing and a life worth saving." Mrs. Patterson, transformed by witnessing the ceremony, became one of the program's most dedicated volunteers, proving that hearts and minds could change when people saw the humanity in others. 2 years later, the morning bench had served over 5,000 meals to veterans and had helped 127 former service members find stable housing and employment. The program became a model for veteran support services nationwide, with Maria speaking at conferences and helping other communities establish similar programs. Colonel Hayes, fully recovered from his grief and depression, became a national advocate for veteran mental health services. His story of homelessness and recovery helped reduce stigma around veteran struggles and encouraged more former service members to seek help. The 12 Marines who had honored Maria at her wedding remained connected to the program, with several relocating to Phoenix to work full-time with veteran services. Their commitment demonstrated that the bonds forged in military service could be channeled into civilian community building. Maria and David's marriage thrived as they worked together to expand their mission of service, proving that shared values and common purpose could strengthen relationships while helping others. 5 years after her wedding, Maria stood in the expanded cafe, watching Colonel Hayes share breakfast with a young veteran who had just arrived from Afghanistan. The scene reminded her of their first tentative conversations, when trust was slowly built through daily acts of kindness. "Thank you," the young veteran said to Colonel Hayes, "for understanding what it's like." "Don't thank me," the colonel replied, gesturing toward Maria. "Thank the woman who taught me that everyone deserves to be seen and cared for." Maria smiled, remembering the simple decision to leave breakfast on a bench for a silent stranger. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness created the largest ripples of change, touching lives in ways that could never be predicted or measured. She fed one homeless veteran, but she nourished an entire community's soul.